You are sitting on your couch at the end of a long, exhausting week. You finally have a moment of silence. You are wearing your most comfortable clothes, ready to disconnect from the world. Suddenly, your phone buzzes. It is a text from an acquaintance asking for a favor, something time-consuming, frustrating, and completely inconvenient. You stare at the screen. You feel a heavy, sinking feeling in your chest. You want to say no. Your body is screaming to say no, but your thumbs move across the keyboard, and almost like a reflex, you type, "Yes, of course." Happy to help, you hit send. You immediately resent them for asking, and you deeply resent yourself for agreeing. Personality changes rarely happen overnight in dramatic cinematic moments. They happen so gradually that people almost never notice them taking place. They begin as ordinary behaviors which turn into daily repetitions, which create subtle psychological effects which slowly calcify into the traits we eventually call our personality. The question we have to ask is not simply why you feel exhausted, but rather, what if some parts of your personality are not simply who you are, but what you have practiced for a very long time? Think of the mind like a path through a forest. Walking through the forest once doesn't create much of a path. But walk in the same direction every day, and the grass slowly bends. The soil compacts. Eventually, the path becomes easier to follow than the untouched woods around it. The brain can work in a similar way. What we repeatedly practice can become easier to repeat. Repeated behaviors and thought patterns can deeply influence our attention, our emotional responses, our expectations, our habits, our self-perception, our coping patterns, and our automatic reactions. This does not mean that your personality is completely determined by your habits, or that your lack of boundaries is entirely your fault. Personality is incredibly complex, shaped by early environment and social conditioning. The goal here is not to suggest a deterministic transformation, but to explain how gradual influence works. Because once you understand how your brain learns to automatically say yes, you can begin to teach it something else. You are at work, already overwhelmed with your own tasks. A colleague approaches your desk and asks if you can take over a project they don't want to do. Before you even check your schedule or assess your own capacity, you smile brightly and say, "Sure, I can handle it." And strangely, the hardest part isn't the extra workload. It is the immediate, visceral guilt you feel at the mere thought of disappointing them. Maybe you call yourself a team player. Maybe you think you are simply a helpful, generous person. Maybe you've started believing that being relentlessly accommodating is just your personality. But this is not because you have limitless energy. This is where the psychology of emotional responsibility and guilt avoidance becomes interesting. When you lack boundaries, you mistakenly believe you are responsible for regulating other people's emotions. Saying no creates an immediate risk of disappointing someone, which triggers acute guilt. Saying yes creates immediate relief from that guilt. And that relief can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate compliance with emotional safety. The problem is that what protects you from feeling guilty today can make the act of prioritizing your own needs feel like a crime tomorrow. You might see this bleed into your daily life. You agree to run errands for family members even when you are sick, or you constantly cover shifts for coworkers who never return the favor. It is like volunteering to carry everyone else's heavy luggage at the airport while completely ignoring your own broken back. At first, you think you are just being kind. But after months of carrying it, you collapse. The refusal to put the bags down doesn't make you a hero. It makes you a casualty. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how much we do. They change our fundamental understanding of whose feelings matter most. If you repeatedly say yes to avoid disappointing others, you may gradually become more comfortable with self-betrayal than external conflict. If you repeatedly take responsibility for everyone's happiness, your own joy may begin to feel less like a right and more like an inconvenience. If you repeatedly practice shielding others from disappointment, disappointment itself may begin to feel like a weapon that can destroy your relationships. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have protected you in a childhood where your worth was tied to your usefulness. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally a chronic people pleaser. Maybe you've simply trained yourself to use compliance as a respectable excuse to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of setting a boundary. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced letting someone be mildly disappointed in you for the next year, what might become easier? You are in a conversation with someone who is being aggressive, pushy, or highly demanding. They ask you to commit to something you fundamentally disagree with. Your heart races, your palms sweat, and your mind goes blank. Instead of asserting your opinion, you immediately shrink. You nod enthusiastically, mirror their opinions, and agree to everything they say just to end the interaction. And strangely, the hardest part isn't doing the thing you hate. It's the immediate, brutal loss of self-respect that follows. Maybe you call yourself easygoing. Maybe you think you simply hate drama and prefer to keep the peace. Maybe you've started believing that being a pushover is just your personality. But this is not because you lack your own opinions. This is where the psychology of the fawn response and threat de-escalation becomes profoundly relevant. In the face of a perceived threat, the nervous system can choose to fight, flee, freeze, or fawn. Fawning is the act of appeasing an aggressor to ensure your own survival. Saying yes to a pushy person creates immediate de-escalation and relief from the threat, and that protection can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate self-abandonment with physical and emotional safety. The problem is that what neutralizes a threat today can make your own internal voice feel completely paralyzed tomorrow. You might find yourself agreeing to terrible financial deals with pushy salespeople, or letting a toxic family member dictate your life choices. It is like throwing pieces of your own flesh to a hungry bear just to keep it from biting you. At first, it is a brilliant survival tactic. But eventually, there is nothing left of you. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change what we agree to. They change our natural capacity to defend our own existence. If you repeatedly use compliance to de-escalate threats, you may gradually become more comfortable with submission than autonomy. If you repeatedly abandon your values to appease loud people, having boundaries may begin to feel less like a right and more like an invitation for an attack. If you repeatedly practice making yourself small, taking up space may begin to feel incredibly dangerous. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have kept you safe in a volatile, unpredictable home environment. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally passive. Maybe you've simply practiced preemptively surrendering to avoid being emotionally attacked. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced holding your ground in a tense conversation for the next year, what might become easier? Notice what is happening here. None of these behaviors look powerful. They look like politeness. They look like kindness. That's precisely why they are powerful. The things that shape us are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are the things we repeat so often, disguised as virtues, that we stop noticing them entirely. By this point, you might be noticing something uncomfortable. Most of these behaviors, the accommodating, the appeasing, the volunteering, don't feel like decisions anymore. They feel like you. That's the strange thing about repetition. At first, you choose the behavior. Eventually, the behavior can begin choosing for you. But a habit can influence your personality without defining your identity. Recognizing a pattern is not a reason to shame yourself. It is a reason to become more conscious of it. You are already swamped with commitments, but you hear about a committee, a project, or a family event that needs organizing. Nobody even asks you to do it, but you immediately raise your hand. You volunteer your time, your money, and your energy. You tell yourself that if you don't do it, everything will fall apart. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the lack of sleep. It's the terrifying realization that without this chaotic responsibility, you don't know who you are. Maybe you call yourself an initiator. Maybe you think you are simply the only capable person in the room. Maybe you've started believing that being the indispensable savior is just your personality. But this is not because you naturally love stress. This is where the psychology of tying self-worth to utility becomes relevant. When you lack intrinsic self-esteem, you must manufacture it externally. Being the person who says yes to everything creates a massive, immediate sense of value. You are needed, therefore you matter. And that validation can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate being useful with being worthy of existing. The problem is that what gives you a sense of purpose today can make the act of simply being alive without producing anything feel entirely empty tomorrow. You might constantly host dinner parties you don't enjoy, or act as the unpaid therapist for all your friends. It is like volunteering to be the central support pillar of a massive stone building. At first, you feel incredibly strong and important. But eventually, the weight crushes you, and you realize nobody ever admired the pillar. They only admired the fact that the roof didn't fall on their heads. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change our schedules. They change how we measure our fundamental right to take up space. If you repeatedly volunteer to prove your worth, you may gradually become more comfortable with exhaustion than stillness. If you repeatedly tie your identity to being indispensable, asking for help yourself may begin to feel less like a human need and more like a failure of character. If you repeatedly practice buying your self-esteem with favors, unconditional love may begin to feel like a completely foreign concept. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have given you a sense of purpose when you felt invisible. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally a workaholic savior. Maybe you've practiced overfunctioning as a respectable excuse to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of wondering if people would still love you if you did absolutely nothing for them. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced letting a project fail without stepping in to save it for the next year, what might become easier? You receive an invitation to an event you absolutely dread. You hate the venue, you dislike the people, and you would rather do anything else. But you have always gone in the past. So you put on nice clothes, force a smile, and spend 4 hours completely miserable. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the boring conversation. It's the sinking suspicion that you are wasting the best years of your life fulfilling obligations you never even wanted. Maybe you call yourself loyal. Maybe you think you're simply honoring traditions and being polite. Maybe you've started believing that sacrificing your free time is just your personality. But this is not because you are exceptionally traditional. This is where the psychology of identity consistency and the sunk cost of politeness becomes profound. We have a deep psychological need to act consistently with our past behavior. Breaking a long-standing pattern of politeness requires rocking the boat and facing potential backlash. Saying yes maintains the status quo and creates immediate relief from social friction. And that conformity can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate sticking to the script with social safety. The problem is that what protects you from awkwardness today can completely divorce you from your own authentic desires tomorrow. You might stay in one-sided friendships for decades, or attend exhausting annual trips that bring you zero joy. It is like staying in a terrible movie theater for 3 hours just because you already paid for the ticket. At first, you think you are just getting your money's worth. But eventually you realize you can never get those 3 hours back. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we spend our weekends. They change how we value our own finite existence. If you repeatedly say yes simply because you always have, you may gradually become more comfortable with resentment than liberation. If you repeatedly prioritize politeness over authenticity, speaking your truth may begin to feel less like honesty and more like a violent rebellion. If you repeatedly practice living out someone else's script, your own life may begin to feel like a performance for an audience you don't even like. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have helped you navigate complex social hierarchies. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you don't actually value traditions that much. Maybe you've aggressively practiced using politeness as a shield against the vulnerability of outgrowing your old environment. What if some of the things you call your personality are simply patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel permanent? What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced saying, "I won't be able to make it," without giving a single excuse for the next year, what might become easier, you are completely depleted. You have nothing left to give. But a friend asks you to help them move apartments on your only day off. You agree immediately. You spend the day lifting heavy boxes, silently raging. You do this because deep down, you harbor a terrifying fear. If you say no, they will be angry. If they are angry, they will pull away. And if they pull away, you will be completely alone. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the physical labor. It's the heartbreaking realization that you do not trust your relationships to survive the word no. Maybe you call yourself a generous friend. Maybe you think you're simply being supportive. Maybe you've started believing that infinite self-sacrifice is just your personality. But this is not because you are exceptionally giving. This is where the psychology of transactional love and the fear of abandonment reaches its peak. We are often conditioned to believe that love is conditional, based purely on our utility. Saying no feels like breaking the contract. Saying yes creates an immediate, desperate reassurance that you will not be abandoned, and that reassurance can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate extreme self-sacrifice with the preservation of love. The problem is that what keeps people around you today guarantees chronic, internal loneliness tomorrow, because they are connecting with your utility, not the real you. You might lend money you don't have, or stay up all night listening to someone vent while your own mental health crumbles. Imagine paying a heavy daily subscription fee just to have a friend. It doesn't change much for a week. Pay the same fee every day for years, however, and eventually you may stop seeing it as a fee. You may start reading it as a description of human connection. I must pay to be loved. The repetition has become automatic. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we help others. They change how we view our fundamental right to exist without earning it. If you repeatedly sacrifice yourself to avoid abandonment, you may gradually become more comfortable with exhaustion than authentic intimacy. If you repeatedly view love as a transaction, setting a boundary may begin to feel less like self-care and more like an act of self-destruction. If you repeatedly practice buying affection with favors, true, unconditional love may begin to feel like an impossible myth. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have kept you safe in relationships where love was highly conditional. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally self-sacrificing. Maybe you have simply practiced abandoning yourself to prevent other people from abandoning you. What if some of the things you call your personality are simply patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel permanent? What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced believing that the right people will love you, even when you have nothing to offer them, what might become easier? But there is a deeper idea underneath all of this. We have been culturally conditioned to view endless compliance as a virtue. We are taught that making ourselves completely available makes the world better for others. We mistake a lack of boundaries for empathy, and we mistake fawning for kindness. But saying yes to everything does not actually serve the world. It deprives the world of your authentic self, and it deprives your loved ones of knowing the actual, honest version of who you are. Understanding this difference between who you are and what you repeatedly practice is the key to untangling your identity from your people-pleasing. Changing a pattern does not mean you have to completely destroy yourself to become a harsh, selfish, unfeeling person. It does not mean you have to become arrogant or disconnected from the people you love. It simply means giving yourself more choices. A steering wheel doesn't decide where a car must go. It simply gives the driver the ability to change direction when the road curves. Awareness works in a similar way. Realizing that you have been practicing the habit of saying yes does not instantly teleport you to a place of perfect boundaries, but it gives you agency. It gives you the steering wheel back. Why does any of this matter? Because the small choices you make every single day are quietly building the architecture of your future mind. One day doesn't define you. One forced smile doesn't define you. One resentful favor doesn't define you. One bad habit doesn't define you. But what you repeatedly return to deserves your attention. The small, quiet ways you swallow your opinions, the subtle ways you buy love with utility, the invisible ways you abandon your own peace, these are not insignificant simply because they are small. They are repeated. And repetition accumulates into a life. What are you practicing becoming? When you look at the life you have built and the exhaustion you have quietly hidden away, are you practicing fear or are you practicing authenticity? You are allowed to protect your energy. You are allowed to disappoint people. You are allowed to say no. Because perhaps the person you become isn't decided in one dramatic, flawless moment of finally setting the perfect boundary. Perhaps they are being shaped quietly, gently, and inevitably in the things you do again tomorrow.